The philosophical discourse surrounding the existence of God frequently centers on the tension between the classical cosmological demonstrations exemplified by the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition and the modern transcendental turn, which prioritizes the conditions for the possibility of experience. A recent critique leveled against the third way of St. Thomas Aquinas suggests that the presupposition of observable reality relies on more fundamental, unexamined presuppositions, such as the self, the validity of logic, and the categories of time and space. Furthermore, it posits that the contingency argument functions as a form of the transcendental argument for God tag, merely applied to empirical data rather than transcendental realities. This analysis serves to provide an exhaustive intellectual framework for addressing these claims through the lens of moderate realism and Thomistic metaphysics. The architectonic of the third way, necessity and contingency in being. The third way, articulated in the Summa Theologia, is fundamentally an argument from the modal status of existence. Aquinas begins with the empirical observation that we find in nature things that are possible to be and not to be contingent beings, as evidenced by their generation and corruption. The logic of the argument rests on the distinction between that which possesses its own necessity and that which receives its necessity from another. A central misunderstanding in modern critiques of the third way is the conflation of contingency with mere temporality. While Aquinas observes that things that cannot be at some time are not, the deeper metaphysical point is that a contingent being does not contain the sufficient reason for its own existence within its essence. If a thing's essence, what it is distinct from its existence, that it is, then its existence must be caused by an external agent. The argument progresses by asserting that if all things were contingent, then at one time there was nothing, which leads to the absurdity that nothing would exist now. Critically, Aquinas is not arguing for a temporal beginning of the universe here, but for a hierarchy of ontological dependence. The first cause is not first in a chronological sequence, but first in the order of causal power, providing the actualization that contingent things lack by nature. The critique that this argument relies on unexamined presupposition of observable reality misses the Thomistic understanding of how the intellect engages with the world. For Aquinas, the starting point of knowledge is not a set of abstract categories, but the radical encounter with ends being.
The Peripatetic Axiom, knowledge as a derivate of experiency. The Thomistic tradition adheres to the Peripatetic Axiom, nihil est in intellectu quod prius non fuerit in sensu, which means that nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses. This foundational principle directly addresses the claim that we presuppose logic or the self to understand reality. In the Thomistic framework, the intellect is initially a tabula rasa, and all conceptual knowledge is abstracted from the data provided by the senses through the phantasms or sense images. The role of the active intellect. Knowledge is not a passive reception of external impressions, but an active process of abstraction. The active intellect, or intellectus agens, illuminates the phantasm, stripping away the individual material conditions to reveal the universal essence or quiddity of the things. This process demonstrates that the metaphysical categories mentioned by the critics, such as existence and substance, are not presupposed. They are discovered through the intellect's engagement with the sensible world. When we observe a contingent object, we are not applying a pre-existing category of contingency. Instead, the intellect recognizes the object's inherent limitation and dependency. This is what is termed being as first known or ens ut primum cognitum. The first concept the mind forms is the concept of being, which is the most basic and universal apprehension. From this primary grasp of being, the mind immediately recognizes the first principles of reason. Logic is a discover, not a presupposition. Critics suggest that logic is a presupposition. However, for Aquinas, the first principles of logic, such as the law of non-contradiction, are derived immediately from the first encounter with being. When the intellect grasps being, It simultaneously understands non-being as its opposite, the principle that a thing cannot be and not be at the same time and in the same respect is intuition based on the very structure of reality. Because these principles are derived from our contact with the actual, real, sensible thing, they are not stipulations or presuppositions in the modern sense. They are the internal structure of reality reflecting itself in the human mind. Consequently, the Thomist does not presuppose logic to prove God. Rather, the intelligibility of the world reveals the logical structure that points toward its source.
The genesis of the self, reflexive versus innate knowledge. A significant part of the critique involves the self and the assertion that as soon as you say, "I exist," you are already presupposing metaphysical categories. This reflects a Cartesian or Kantian starting point that is fundamentally alien to Thomism. In the Thomistic view, the soul does not have direct, innate knowledge of its own essence. Self-awareness through activity. Aquinas maintains that the intellect knows itself only by its acts. We do not first know the self and then look out at the world. We first know an object like a tree or a stone. And through the act of knowing that object, we reflexively become aware of the act of knowing and subsequently, the I who is doing the knowing. As G.K. Chesterton famously noted, a child is conscious of the grass long before they are conscious of the retina or the self. Therefore, I exist is not a presupposition, but a second-order discovery. The first-order fact is there is an is. This priority of the object over the subject is essential for realism. If the self were the starting point, we would be trapped in a subjective idealism where the existence of the external world would require a complex proof. By starting with ends, Aquinas avoids the skeptical pitfalls of modern philosophy. Hylomorphism and the self. The self that we discover is not a floating consciousness, but a unified substance of soul and body. This is the doctrine of hylomorphism. The soul is the substantial form of the matter. Our experience of self-sensing, the tacit awareness of where our limbs are, and our subjective interiorities, evidence for this metaphysical composition. We do not presuppose the category of the self to have this experience. The experience is the manifestation of our nature as rational animals.
The critic also claims that existence, time, and space are presuppositions. Within the Thomistic framework, however, time and space are not a priori forms of intuition that the mind imposes on reality as Kant argued, but are rooted in the physical reality of substance and motion. Time as the measure of motion. Aquinas, following Aristotle, defines time as the number of motion according to before and after. Time is an accidental property of motion, and motion is a property of physical bodies. Time exists potentially in the events of the world, and is given formal being by the soulless act of numbering these events. Because time is derived from motion, we do not need to presuppose it to see a world of change. Instead, the perception of change motion allows the intellect to abstract the concept of time. If we deny the real being of time, we deny the reality of motion, which would effectively destroy the science of physics. Aquinas notes that while time exists in the mind as a measure, it corresponds to a real, flowing successiveness in the material world. Space and magnitude. Similarly, the concept of space is derived from the magnitude or extension of physical bodies. A natural body is finite in magnitude, and space is effectively the place occupied by such bodies. We do not presuppose a vast, empty space category to perceive a body. Rather, the presence of a body with dimensions provides the ground for our understanding of place and distance. Aquinas argues that what we think of as space beyond the universe is merely imaginary space, as real space requires the presence of a physical body. The suggestion that the contingency argument is kind of like tag, except applying to empiricism instead of transcendental realities, is an insightful observation that touches on the foundational goals of both arguments while missing their structural differences. Tag is a family of arguments from the possibility of human thought and experience. It argues that God is the necessary precondition for the intelligibility of logic, science, and ethics. The core of tag is typically expressed as, if there is a transcendental unity of apperception, an intelligible consciousness, then God exists. Without God, knowledge is impossible, and logic is groundless. The third way and tag are cousins in that both seek to ground finite reality in an infine source. However, tag is often world-directed in an ambitious sense. It tries to prove the truth of a claim about reality, God's existence, by showing that the alternative leads to the total collapse of reason. The contingency argument is more object-direct. It looks at the being of the things we see, and concludes they cannot exist here and now without a source of being. A major challenge for tag is the Strudian objection, which states that showing how we must think about the world does not necessarily prove how the world actually is. Tag establishes a conceptual necessity, but struggles to bridge the gap to ontological reality without falling into circularity. Thomism avoids this by grounding the third way in the is of observable reality. Because the argument starts with the extramental existence of things, its conclusion a necessary being shares in that same extramental reality. We do not just need God to make sense of logic. God must exist because contingent things actually exist. The aforementioned criticism reflects a presuppositional mindset, which denies that there is neutral ground for reasoning with non-believers. Presuppositionalists, such as Van Til, argue that because everything belongs to God, one cannot interpret a single fact like an elephant or a law of logic without first presupposing the God of the Bible. The Thomist response to this is to distinguish between the Ordo Essendi order of being and the Ordo Cognoscendi order of knowing. Order of being. God is indeed the first cause of everything. Without him, neither the elephant nor the human mind would exist. Order of knowing. Human knowledge begins with the finite effect. We know the elephant's elephantness, trough our shared rational faculty and sensory contact before we deduce its cause. By conflating these two orders, it is suggested that we cannot know anything until we know the ground of everything. Thomists argue that this leads to an idealist definition of knowledge that would require omniscience to know even the simplest truth. If we had to know God to know a fact, we would never get started, because God is the most difficult thing for the human mind to grasp. The presuppositional often relies on the doctrine of internal relations, which posits that a thing is defined entirely by its relationship to the whole system of reality. In this view, if you subtract God from a fact, the fact ceases to be intelligible. Thomism counters this with the doctrine of essences. Things have a hard core of being in themselves, an essence that allows them to be what they are, even if the observer does not yet know their ultimate cause. We can know that it is a logic or that a triangle has three sides without knowing the Trinity, because these truths are grounded in the natures of the things themselves, which God created to be intelligible. The critics mention that as soon as you say exist, you are already presupposing metaphysical categories. In the Thomistic tradition, the proposition, God exists, is not self-evident to us, even if it is self-evident in itself. Aquinas rejects the ontological argument like Anselm's precisely because it tries to move from the concept of God to the existence of God. Similarly, we do not start with the concept of the self or existence. We start with the experience of existing things. The metaphysical categories are the labels we give to the structures we encounter. Existence is the act of being that we observe in things. Time is the measure of the change we witness. Space is the extension of the matter we touch. The critics treat these as pre-loaded software in the mind, but the Thomist treats them as the texture of the world that the mind is designed to feel. The Thomistic approach represents a sober middle ground between the vicious extremes of rationalism and empiricism. The Thomist acknowledges that knowledge starts with experience, but insists that the intellect can transcend experience. We start with the fact that change occurs, and demonstrate the existence of a prime unmoved mover. This is not a God of the gaps argument, but a deductive necessity based on the nature of being. To rebut the critics' claim effectively, one must emphasize that what they call presuppositions are actually discoveries. The human mind is not an isolated chamber projecting a grid of time and space onto a green mist. Rather, The mind is like an eye designed for light. Just as the eye doesn't presuppose light to see a tree, it simply sees the tree in the light, the intellect doesn't presuppose logic to see a contingent being. It simply recognizes the being's structure. The critics worry that observable reality relies on other presuppositions is a symptom of the Cartesian anxiety, the fear that if we don't have an absolute internal starting point like the cogito, we can't trust anything. Thomism cuts through this by pointing out that the very act of doubting presupposes that there is something to doubt. The I exist of the doubter is only possible because there is an is that they are reacting to. The comparison to tag is actually a complement to the third way's depth, even if their technical categorization is slightly off. The third way does function as a grounding argument, much like tag. However, while tag focuses on the ground of thought, the third way focuses on the ground of existence. If the universe were indeed brute and contingent, with no necessary being to ground it, then there would be no explanation for why anything exists at all rather than nothing. The laws of logic and the categories of time and space would have nothing to hold on to. By establishing God as the necessary being, Aquinas provides the foundation that the critics are looking for, but he finds it by looking at the world, not by looking away from it. In conclusion, the third way remains a robust demonstration because it honors the reality of the world we inhabit. It does not ask us to retreat into our own minds to find God. It asks us to look more deeply at the contingent things in our path, the trees, the stars, and even ourselves, and realize that they are all participation in a being who cannot not be. This is not a presupposition. It is the ultimate discovery of reason.